Thank you very much, Per, for the nice introduction, and it's really nice to be here and honored to be speaking in front of such distinguished guests today. My name is Hankyeol Lee, as Per has introduced. I was thinking, when I was traveling from Seoul to Helsinki for this event 2 days ago, how ironic it is that over the past few years, the global diplomatic world has been quite volatile. And when I first joined Reddal, coming to Helsinki, it took about 8.5 hours, and now it takes over 13 hours, even direct flight. And that's of course because of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, and you have to go around that big block of land. And you would think that as the world matures, it will be easier to actually connect with different. The Asian economy really developing? What challenges does it face? And also, what does Europe have to do with this? And specifically, can Finland do something in this arena? But let's first start with looking at the map of Asia here. It's overlaid with some numbers and circles that show the size of the city-level economies. And as you can see, compared to the entire Finnish GDP, Swedish GDP, some of these cities are even greater than that. And that already makes you appreciate how diverse this landscape really is and how big the market is. And I turn your attention to the right side of this chart. By 2030, Asia is going to be about 60% of the global economy. And that's a lot more than Europe and North America combined, for instance. So what are the countries? I mean, there's the usual suspects like China, Japan, India, and Korea. But there's also other countries like in Southeast Asia that's growing quite rapidly, as you can see from the GDP year-over-year growth as well. So this means this is not the Asia of the 1980s. This is not your father's Asia. It's not defined by the Japanese huge asset bubble during the time when it bursted and had gone back to where it previously was. This is a lot broader, this is a lot faster and a lot more complex, which we all need to appreciate. So the question for Europe is, do we engage? It's not, do we engage? So let's not ask questions like that, but it should be rather, when and how should we lead in this region? And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And here is a simple illustration showing how Asian countries always face the challenge of balancing, especially true during these days when the US and China rivalry and the trade war is ongoing. On one hand, you have the economic strategy of different countries. Of course, trade is very important. Whether you're selling to China, US, always having the surplus is very important for trade-driven export-import economies of Asia. And of course, attracting, especially for Southeast Asian countries, foreign direct investments is quite important. For Korea and Japan, for instance, supply chain is a huge issue, right? So thinking about battery, thinking about chips and all this high-tech stuff, having the security of the manufacturing chain, where the raw materials come from, those are all feeding into the national security as well. On the other side, then you have the diplomatic allegiances, sometimes which conflict or can conflict with the economic strategy of the countries. So pressure to choose sides, this applies a lot to perhaps smaller economies. The larger economies, I think, have the luxury of balancing a little better. And then also the security guarantees, especially in areas where it's closer to aggressors, like in South China Seas, and also Northeast Asia. Facing Russia, having the US security there is quite beneficial for these countries as well. And as mentioned, territorial tensions with China and Russia is always feeding into this nerve-wracking sort of a picture. So when you see that Asian countries are not really taking sides, it's not because of their indecisiveness, but rather it's a survival strategy for them. So now let's look into a couple different regions. We have now selected 4 different regions, China, Korea, and Japan together, because there are some similarities there that we like to point out. Southeast Asia is a huge market that's just growing so fast, and you'll be surprised what types of things are actually happening that you haven't seen ever before in that region. So we'll talk about those, actually 3 regions, and then we'll move on to the deep tech story, which is a story of Korea really trying to survive in this wild. So let's first look at China. China has been or is now regarded as by everyone a global superpower, and they are competing directly head-to-head with the US, for instance. We all know that, but China is also experiencing a lot of challenges domestically. They have the economy slowing down domestically, having a lot of issues related to both supply chain, labor shortages, not to mention the real estate issues, so overhang being in there. And the Chinese Communist Party, of course, they want to reestablish their power and want to be confirmed by their own people and their own industry. So what they're trying to do now is called dual circulation strategy. This is to depict the strategy where they do well domestically. So doing things like pushing for high-tech supply chain and bringing those high-quality jobs in, while they're offshoring some of the low-value-add goods supply and chain to other regions like West Asia and Southeast Asia. But at the same time, they want to do well globally as well. So what that means is that you're seeing Chinese companies more and more being fierce in regions such as right here in Europe and also in the Americas, including the US. So what does this mean for Europe and Finland? This means, in one way, that you're competing against the Chinese companies in China if you're willing to export to China. But at the same time, you're competing against Chinese companies everywhere. Wherever you are, you're gonna start seeing Chinese companies if you haven't seen yet, but I'm sure that if you're a CEO running a large company, you have seen this already, and this is no longer a news to you. So China is now sort of behaving as a forbidden garden. So for European companies, if you want to succeed, this is no longer a market where you just export the goods and capture value, but rather you have to be in China, for China, and be part of the Chinese strategy and align with the CPP's strategy as well. So that is something that you have to consider, and it's a tall order. How about Korea and Japan? Perhaps a bit easier to enter, but it still faces a lot of issues structurally. And one main thing is that there's a lot of legacy effects coming from the conglomerate-driven economy. So in Korea, conglomerates called chaebols, and in Japan, kiretsu, as some of you might be familiar with these terms. And the SMEs in these areas suffer productivity issues quite strongly. I think in Korea, 80% of the people are now employed by SMEs, but the productivity is staggeringly low compared to the conglomerates. I think the contribution of GDP is about 40%. So you already see how that causes an issue, and that leads to multitudes of problems like the staggeringly low birth rates. In Korea, there's a term called 해조선, which now explains how hellish it is to live in Korea that has become today's Korea. We have the lowest birth rate actually in the world. I'm not proud of saying this, but it is at 0.7 child per woman. Japan faring a little better at 1.2 per woman, but still very, very low. So these are really becoming the future labs of the low birth rate countries, and Europe can also consider them as somewhat negative benchmarks as well. And there is also fierce competition coming both domestically and globally, facing countries and industries like the Chinese ones, for instance. Over-concentration of power in legacy firms always a difficult thing to navigate as well, and not to mention the geopolitical tension, supply chain realignments, and digital and green pressure. So there's a lot of pressure from all around domestically. They need to excel, they need to keep doing and keep selling to the foreign companies, like Hyundai did, like Samsung did, like LG did. But what's the future of that? Are they gonna continue to be those conglomerates that have been for the past 3-4 decades? Probably not, and we're seeing that. And deep tech could be one way to resolve that and address those issues. But what does it mean for Europe in parallel? Well, it could mean that Europe can think about deeper partnerships than just import-export, right? So we know that there are structural issues like the talent issue, labor shortages. So what can Europe do in terms of talent influx and education and all that kind of stuff? And also thinking about their strategic investments in these countries to boost and leverage the existing infrastructure can be another thing. And co-developing technologies in the frontier parts like deep tech, chips, all these types of stuff can be a valuable asset for the European countries in the long run down the road as well. Now let's talk about Southeast Asia. Quite a different market, I would say. And there's a lot to say about Southeast Asia, and I don't think I can capture everything, but I'll try my best to illustrate what is happening in terms of the ASEAN level economic bloc and what they're aiming to do, how is it actually, and what can Europe do to help them. So I think most of you might be aware that ASEAN is aiming to build more of a consolidated front for the Southeast Asian companies, and it is huge by numbers. So $4 trillion last year, so making it the 5th largest economic bloc after US, China, EU, and Japan. And the population is also humongous at around 700 million people last year, which is 50% bigger than the European Union's populations. But as you can see, these are a lot of different countries put in one basket, and that causes some issues, and we don't see too much of a consolidated actions coming from the ASEAN countries, unfortunately, today. And European influence has been also quite limited. So if you look at the FTAs, free trade agreements, only Singapore and Vietnam has had bilateral agreements with Europe so far. So a lot of untapped opportunities here, and also it can be considered as an uncharted territory for Europe as of today. And to add on to those issues, before I talk about the good things that can happen, now China's facing a lot of, sorry, not China, Southeast Asia is facing a lot of pressure from this volatility that is the diplomatic world of today, and Trump 2.0, and also the Chinese pressure. So not only do we now deal with the internal development constraints like infrastructure and investments, but also the external pressures like the strong Chinese influence, sometimes being called China's backyard, and also lack of cohesion, as I mentioned in the previous slide about ASEAN's role. And having varying stances on global strategic competition is also quite of an issue. So one particular example is that some countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, they have the luxury of being sort of neutral and hedging countries in this region, whereas some of the smaller economies like, let's say, Laos, Cambodia, Philippines, these are the countries that have sort of faced the issue of, or being pressured into corner to become more pro-China, and at the same time, of course, some countries pro-US. So you see the diverse range and a spectrum of different countries here working perhaps not together that well at the moment, but that also presents opportunities for Europe, right? So Europe has a real potential here to become the third partner. It's not just about US and China going there and telling them what to do. You have to first, of course, build a trust and try to leverage what they do and be in a good partnership, and that takes time, but when you do that, you can really help them scale and transition. There's a lot of opportunity to finance some of the ongoing investments as well. I'm gonna show one example of Vietnam doing semicon development here, and they now look to become the local hub of the global semiconductor value chain here by 2050. So they're looking down 25 years down the road, and they're gonna have a cumulative number of 6 fabs by then, which is a lot more than some of the other developed countries. So this already tells you how the government ambition is quite high, and this might be one way for them to build resilience against many things that are happening in the region. So Europe can be a real partner here. They're always looking for infrastructure development, investments, so on and so forth. So this is something that one could consider, and this is not just Vietnam, right? This is also happening in Malaysia. Many different industries are being developed all over the ASEAN countries. So this is really worth your attention if you're considering Southeast Asian market. Now then, let's talk about deep tech as one example of how the Korean economy is aiming to rejuvenate itself. And I mentioned to you a couple different challenges that Korea is facing. And by the way, I give also credits to people who are in this room, especially Tessie and one of the co-authors, Yusuf Saad, who has participated in the Tessie Deep Tech report. As Per has mentioned, we have been inspired to follow suit in the Korean landscape, and this is what came about. Korea is facing a lot of issues internally and also externally. And in terms of deep tech, you would think that Korea, being a high-tech country and having all these companies like Samsung, LG making really good TVs, washing machines, things will be already on a good track, but that's not really the case. A lot of these startups who are trying to go global have not been so successful at that. There's not a lot of exit options. Korea stays quite insular, meaning that a lot of exits are happening as domestic IPOs instead of, say, in Finland, you're doing a lot of IPOs in NASDAQ and foreign markets like in the UK as well. And conversion of the basic science research into commercial innovation is quite low as well. So these are the things that are showing. So perhaps a first world problem in a way. A lot of companies are quite comfortable being domestically oriented, but in the end, this doesn't really help Korea propel and become the world's deep tech hub. So here we have come up with an issue analysis. By the way, we'll share all the materials with you after the event today, so you'll have time to take a look at this at your own pace and judge for your own. But here we are basically saying that there's three different stakeholders that are startups, investors, and government, and they all need to work very collaboratively. But at the same time, they have the individual responsibilities to push this really forward and for it to become really the next global deep tech hub, which I believe it can in the near future. It has to work really hard and think about the foreign examples and benchmark them and all that. And Europe, I think, has a huge role to play here. Europe, even smaller countries like Finland here, we have a lot of deep tech companies, as we have seen in the Tessie report. And I think a lot of CEOs here today can concur with my statement there. We see Kuba Space, for example, doing great things in the satellite regime. And we see other companies as well doing a lot of sustainability stuff, doing things globally, not just staying in Finland and being really international. And those are the things that should be reflected in the Korean deep tech ecosystem as well. Now we have defined what deep tech is in this report. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we have looked at deep tech companies in Korea and defined and handpicked 432 different firms across 10 different sectors. And you might wonder, why is biotechnology so high? We see about 215 companies, so about half of the listed companies being from biotech. This is not necessarily meaning that we have a lot of rising number of biotech companies, but Korea has always had a long stream of biotech venture funds and also smaller startups acting. And deep tech term has not been coined until a few years ago, and they happen to fall in nicely in this area. But if you look at the other sectors, considering the size of the entire Korean economy, the counts are actually not that high, and this already signals a concern for us. And there's other thematic stuff like AI. So of course, ChatGPT being introduced a few years ago by OpenAI in the US, that has really influenced the Korean companies to do a similar thing and drive the derivative products off of that. But again, this already tells us we need to not be a fast follower, but be a first mover in this space. And just following the AI hype, quote unquote, and making chatbot companies and really low value technology is really not worth our time either. So I'll be discussing what can we do, and note there's no nuclear companies here at all, which is another proof that this is a very hype-dependent sector and a region. To talk more about the Korean VC ecosystem, we have been doing quite well since the 1980s. We have been developing the infrastructure, we have been developing the government funds, many different investment devices, many different companies really falling into this government's strategy scheme and then supporting that overall ecosystem. But one thing is that it's not very resilient against any external factors. So if you look at this boom and bust cycle, more or less, that we have drawn here, depending on what's happening outside of Korea, we have really followed that trend in terms of investment number, deal sizes, all that kind of stuff. And the world tells us we might be going into another bust cycle, and I don't know how long that's going to last. But if you have the real technology that is handy, that is tangible, and that can go overseas and attract the customer attention, investor attention, Korea's economy is going to be a lot more resilient than it is today, and it doesn't necessarily have to follow the boom and bust cycle. So what we're saying here is the key to success in deep tech in Korea is really the deep tech itself and the technology, not the fancy investment devices, not the government trying to define what it should be. So we here define a few different recommendations for the three stakeholders that I've mentioned. For startups, for instance, it's really about going global and resolving the most complicated, most difficult challenges that humankind has ever seen. So not just staying at home and then fixing smaller problems here and there with some AI chatbots, but really going after, for instance, satellite, for instance, nuclear, for instance, quantum computing to make this world a better place. That's really the thing that they should be doing. For investors, similar thing in terms of how they should push for this type of innovation, but at the same time, understanding what deep tech really is. It's a shame that over 40% of the top Korean VCs have associate level, have STEM background, but I think it requires a bit more than just having STEM background. It requires really appreciating what these technologies are and how this can become the next big thing. And we don't really see that, unfortunately, sort of at the same level across the entire VC industry in Korea. And also diversifying the LP composition. We see a lot of government funds being pulled into this type of environment and people being more or less happy, maybe doing 10% return, 15% return maybe at maximum. But we should be aiming for higher. We should be talking to the sovereign wealth funds. We should be talking to the foreign banks and all these type of people and organizations who have deeper expertise and experience in these types of things. So not being insular, staying insular, but going global here is also another thing that we are proposing. For government, hate to say this, but sort of lowering their participation level overall, being supportive of course, but in terms of regulations, a lot of things needs to be undone in terms of investment restrictions and portfolio management, especially with fund of funds. That's a huge issue. So that needs to be resolved, especially for the foreign investors to participate in this a bit more. In terms of testing new technologies like autonomous vehicles driving down the road, we don't see as much. We have the world's largest vehicle companies like Hyundai, Kia, and a few others. And I don't see, like, when you go in California, you see Waymo cars just driving down the road with no drivers. We don't see that, so we need to make these things happen and make sure that this can really become the global stage for all the world's new technologies to come in and be tested and find these customers as well. Overall, when we draw the roadmap, which is part of the deep tech study you will find later, it's really all about globalization. First phase started with nurturing the future global deep tech champions. That requires global customers, investors, Phase 2, same thing, ecosystem expansion, again, going global, attraction of global talent and larger investment. Phase 3, global positioning. This is more apparent than the 2 phases, right? So going into all these things, going into bleeding edge technologies and quantum and nuclear are the things that we are thinking. And this is not something that can be done just domestically in Korea, or in partners has a huge role to play here. So what can Europe do? What can Finland do? Well, first of all, Finland has great technology, great human resources. Why not come to Korea and test these ideas and work with Korean companies? Sure, Korean companies might be a little bit difficult to work with at first. Culture is different, their business language is different, all these things, but I think it's really worth a try. So, not an advertisement as such, but I think this Korean deep tech ecosystem is really worth your attention as well. And now let's bring it home with this last section. For Europe, Asian volatility is always going to be a challenge and a very sensitive topic to bring up and also consider internally when you're thinking about your company's strategies. But here are the 4 things that we can say. So Europe must move beyond the passive observation and be really active, proactive in the Asian region. Europe has long been considered a great partner, but they have been too passive in my opinion. It can do a lot more now that Asia is facing a lot of pressure. It's a pressure cooker basically. So why not go in there and try to resolve and try to partner up with these guys and do great things. And then second, engagements should be country specific. There is no just one Asian market. I mean, Asia is 60% of the global economy. Are you going to call that one market? No. So how do you define China specific? How do you define Vietnam specific? How do you define Korea specific strategies? That really comes down to understanding the market, understanding your customers, understanding your investors, supply chain, so on and so forth. So that's a must. Third, strategic ambiguity in Asia is here to stay, and Europe must really respect that and try not to play the binary terms like, are you with us or are you against us? That type of stuff doesn't work or doesn't help either. And the opportunity, lastly, exists for Europe as a trusted third partner, as said before. So what can Europe do in Asia? What can we offer other than just selling is something that we have to think about. So technology, standards, and capital without hard power rivalry. These are all the things that will be highly, highly appreciated in the Asian market overall. While Asia, I said, is not just one market. I think this is sort of the unifying factors that we can think about. So they say that allies are earned through relevance, but I think the first step of finding relevance is actually engaging. So let's go out there, let's engage with each other and bring this world closer together. Thank you very much.